In 1990, a teenage girl from Oregon disappeared without leaving behind a single clue, leaving her parents in a state of uncertainty and heartache for more than 20 years. However, 22 years later, her father was flipping through one of her old-school yearbooks when he noticed something that changed everything. A thick fog drifted in from the Pacific Ocean, enveloping the coastal town of Mornington, Oregon, in its usual blanket of early morning mist. Frank Sanders stood at the window of his daughter's bedroom, gazing out as the haze curled and swirled around the lighthouse at the distant point. The natural beauty of this quiet town, its dense forests, steep cliffs, and sweeping views of the sea, had once brought him peace. But ever since his daughter had vanished without explanation 22 years ago, that same landscape had become a reminder of sorrow. Turning away from the view, Frank allowed his eyes to wander across the room, which remained just as Alicia had left it all those years ago. Nothing had been touched since that spring day in 1990, a few weeks after she had graduated from high school. The posters on the walls were still pinned in place. Her desk was still neatly arranged with textbooks and notebooks. Her closet remained full of clothes, untouched for more than 2 decades. "It's time," he murmured to himself, recalling the late-night conversation he had shared with his wife, Elaine. The two of them had finally come to the heartbreaking agreement. After 22 years, it was time to accept the truth. They had to let go of the hope that Alicia would ever return. Today would be the day they would go through her things, donate what might help other children, and store the rest in the attic. Frank opened the window, inviting in the crisp ocean air, which instantly stirred the layers of dust that had settled undisturbed for years. He sneezed and rubbed his eyes, then approached the closet and began gently removing Alicia's clothes. Each garment he touched carried with it a flood of memories. The blue sweater she always wore, the dress from her junior prom, the old jeans, decorated with patches she had sewn on herself. He worked slowly and carefully, sorting each item into boxes, one for donation, one for storage, and one for keepsakes. When he reached her school supplies, however, he paused. These items symbolized the dreams and goals his daughter had once cherished, the future that was never realized. Alicia had been accepted to the University of Oregon and had planned to pursue a degree in marine biology. As Frank sifted through the textbooks and binders, his hands landed on a book he didn't recognize at first. Alicia's high school yearbook. To his surprise, he realized he had never opened it before. In the days following her disappearance, neither he nor Elaine had been able to face the photographs, images of their daughter smiling, full of life, frozen in time alongside her classmates. The classmates who had moved on with their lives now seemed like distant memories. Frank sat down at the edge of Alicia's bed, holding the yearbook in his hands. The weight of it felt heavy, almost symbolic, as though he were grasping a tangible fragment of his daughter's life, one he had never truly explored before. Slowly, he turned the glossy pages until his eyes landed on Alicia's senior portrait. Her smile, full of brightness and hope, struck him like a familiar wound, bringing with it a fresh wave of grief. 22 years, he murmured, gently tracing her face with his fingertip. "I need to learn how to keep you in my heart without this pain, sweetheart." As he stared at the photo, his gaze drifted to the one beside hers, Amy Davidson, Alicia's best friend. Seeing Amy's face brought a cascade of memories rushing back. Childhood sleepovers, family dinners at their house, and the two girls giggling as they whispered secrets late into the night. Frank suddenly realized he hadn't heard anything about Amy in years. After Alicia vanished, Amy had continued visiting them regularly for a few months, bringing moments of comfort during that painful time. But eventually, those visits had stopped, and they had lost touch. Curious, Frank flipped to the section of The yearbook featuring individual student profiles. Each senior had a dedicated page with a brief biography and a personal quote. He located Alicia's page and began reading the words she had written back when she had her entire future ahead of her. "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me, to my teachers who pushed me to do better, and to my best friend Amy. Don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, Illustrated Classic Edition. You old grandma, love you forever." Frank let out a chuckle, the sound bittersweet, caught somewhere between fondness and pain. That playful comment about Amy was so perfectly reflective of their friendship. With a small smile, he turned the page and found Amy's profile. He read about her hopes and goals, her biography filled with words about ambition, chasing dreams, and standing up for oneself. Frank's thoughts returned to The Secret Garden, the book Alicia had mentioned in her message to Amy. It had been her favorite since she was a little girl. She had loved collecting different editions of it. Had Amy ever returned that copy? Frank couldn't remember ever seeing it among Alicia's belongings. Driven by a sudden curiosity, he began rummaging through the boxes of Alicia's books. The dust, disturbed by the search, made his eyes sting and his nose run, so he carried the boxes into the living room, where the air was clearer and he could breathe more easily. There, he carefully unpacked the contents, arranging the books and magazines across the coffee table and the floor. He came across fantasy novels, science textbooks, and nature magazines, but not the illustrated edition of The Secret Garden. Frank wondered if Amy might still have it, even after all this time. On impulse, he flipped to the back of the yearbook, where some students had jotted down their contact details. Sure enough, Amy had scribbled her phone number along with a short note. "Call me anytime, BFF." Reaching for his phone, Frank dialed the number, not truly expecting it to work after more than 2 decades. As he had suspected, an automated voice message informed him that the number was no longer in service. Just then, the front door opened and Elaine entered, her arms full of grocery bags from the farmer's market. She stopped in her tracks, taking in the sight of the living room scattered with books and magazines. "Frank, what is all this?" she asked, her tone sharp with surprise and laced with something deeper. "Hurt. I was just going through Alicia's things like we planned," Frank replied, rising to his feet. Elaine's expression hardened. "We agreed to sort and store her things, not to spread them all over the house. I thought we were finally ready to move forward, not slip back into the past again." "I'm not slipping back, Elaine," Frank said softly. "I found her yearbook, and I was looking for something." "What could possibly be so important?" she snapped, setting the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter. Her movements were stiff, her frustration barely concealed. Without saying a word, Frank held out the yearbook and showed it to her. Pointing to Alicia's handwritten note about the secret garden, Frank explained, "She mentioned a book that Amy had borrowed. I was just curious if it might still be among her belongings." Elaine let out a heavy sigh. "A book, Frank? It doesn't matter anymore. Alicia's books are just collecting dust. We shouldn't bother Amy with something like this. She's probably forgotten all about it by now." Frank shifted the conversation slightly, asking, "Do you know where Amy is these days?" "Yes," Elaine replied, continuing to unpack the groceries she had brought in. "I see her sometimes when I go into town. She's living in a camper now." "I was thinking," Frank said cautiously, "maybe I'd visit her. Not just because of the book, of course. It's been so long since we last saw her, and she used to be like family." Elaine stopped what she was doing and turned to face him fully. "Frank, I can't do that today. I have nothing against Amy, but I'm not ready to see her, not right now. Last night, we agreed to clean things up and let go of hope. Going to see Amy today feels like going backwards, not forwards." She gestured at the mess in the living room. "I'll stay here and take care of this. Pack things up for the attic like we planned. If you want to visit her, that's up to you." Frank nodded, understanding her hesitation. It was just a sudden thought. "I'll go alone," he said. Elaine gave him directions to where Amy usually parked her camper, but added a word of caution. "Don't push her too much, Frank." Alicia's disappearance must have been incredibly hard on her too. They were practically sisters. Gathering up the yearbook, his phone, wallet and car keys, Frank headed for the door. Before stepping out, he glanced back at Elaine, who had already begun organizing Alicia's books neatly into boxes. A wave of guilt washed over him for leaving her with the emotional and physical task, but something inside was urging him toward Amy, toward answers he wasn't even sure how to put into words. The door clicked shut behind him as he stepped out into the grey, mist-laden morning of Mornington. The yearbook was clutched tightly against his chest, like a fragile piece of the past he didn't want to lose. Driving along the winding coastal roads, Frank followed the directions Elaine had given him. The route took him about 20 minutes, from the town centre, leading to a quiet stretch of land where several camper vans were parked along the edge of a wooded area. The spot had a humble charm, with nature encroaching gently on the small community. As Frank pulled into the gravel lot and parked, he surveyed the line of campers, about a dozen in total. They varied in size and condition. Some looked like permanent homes, with tiny gardens and bits of outdoor furniture set up beside them. Frank approached a man who was busy cleaning the windows of his RV. "Excuse me," Frank said politely. "I'm looking for Amy Davidson. Do you happen to know which one is hers?" The man paused and pointed toward a blue and white camper at the far end of the row. "That's Amy's place. Nice lady, mostly keeps to herself." Thanking the man, Frank made his way toward the camper. It was modest in appearance but appeared well cared for. A small potted plant sat beside the door, adding a touch of life and personality to the exterior. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Frank raised his hand and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open. Standing there was a woman in her early 40s. Her once blonde hair was now laced with strands of grey and faint lines around. Her eyes and mouth suggested the passage of time and life's burdens. She looked at Frank with a polite but puzzled expression. There was no recognition in her eyes. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice polite yet cautious. In that moment, Frank suddenly realized that they wouldn't recognize each other, not after all these years. The last time they had seen one another, Amy had been just a teenager, and he had been 22 years younger. "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father," he said gently. Her eyes widened in shock, quickly filling with a mix of emotions, recognition, sorrow, and a warmth rooted in familiarity. "Mr. Sanders! Oh my goodness," she breathed. "Please come in." She stepped aside, opening the door wider to allow him entry. Frank climbed the 2 small steps into the camper. Though compact, the space felt cozy and personal, decorated, with touches that made it feel like home. Photographs, small plants, and colorful cushions. "Please have a seat." "Would you like some coffee?" Amy asked, gesturing toward the small dining area. "Coffee would be nice, thank you," Frank replied as he settled into the cushioned bench seat. As Amy moved to prepare the coffee, Frank observed her carefully. Her actions were slow and deliberate, as if she were giving herself time to absorb the unexpected nature of his visit. "What brings you here after all these years?" she asked, as she placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table. Frank reached into his bag and pulled out the yearbook he had brought along. "I came across this today while going through Alicia's room. I realized I'd never actually looked through it before." Amy's gaze locked onto the yearbook. "I remember this," she said softly, her fingers brushing the cover gently. Frank opened the book to Alicia's profile and pointed to the handwritten note referencing a borrowed book. "She mentioned this book. I was wondering, did you ever return it to her?" Amy's face softened into a wistful smile, tinged with regret. "No, I didn't," I was such a forgetful girl back then, and Alicia always teased me about it, she said with a faint laugh. She stood up and walked over to a small cabinet tucked beneath her bed. After a bit of rummaging, she pulled out a worn but clearly cherished copy of The Secret Garden, the illustrated classic edition. I kept forgetting to give it back, she admitted. And then after she disappeared, I just couldn't let it go. It's the last thing I have of hers. Amy cradled the book gently in her hands, as though it might break. Would you mind terribly if I kept it? It's become very dear to me over the years. Frank nodded with full understanding. Of course, you can keep it. When Amy handed the book to him, he held it with quiet reverence and opened it slowly. The pages were yellowed with time, but the illustrations remained, vivid and beautiful. As he flipped through, something slipped out and landed on the table, a torn page that looked like it had come from an old youth fashion magazine. He unfolded it and found it was a photo spread featuring teenage models. A particular image of a young boy dressed in stylish clothes caught his attention. There was something oddly familiar about him. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing at the model. Amy leaned forward to take a closer look. "That's Jason Murray. He was in our class." Frank turned back to the yearbook and found Jason's photo near Alicia's. "I remember now," he said. He was quite the talent, modeling even back then. "He still models occasionally, from what I've heard," Amy added. "He even has his own fashion line now." Frank glanced up thoughtfully. "You know, Elaine once mentioned that you were dating Jason. Back then, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time." Amy's expression shifted abruptly. "That's not true at all," she said firmly. "I never dated Jason." "Jason," Amy repeated, shaking her head. "In fact, I never even liked him. He actually spent more time with Alicia for a while." That revelation caught Frank off guard. "Alicia? She and Elaine never mentioned Jason to me." "It happened during our junior year, 11th grade, about a year before graduation," Amy explained. "Jason seemed to have a crush on Alicia for a few months, but it didn't last. Once we figured out what kind of person he really was, we both kept our distance. Alicia never brought him up again." Amy paused, as if a memory had just resurfaced. "Actually, now that I think about it, I did see them talking a few times during senior year. They seemed pretty close, which was strange because we had already agreed that he was bad news. Alicia even asked me a few odd questions about him." Frank leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of questions?" "She asked me if I thought someone like Jason just needed help to change. If maybe he wasn't as bad as we assumed," Amy recalled. "She even asked me to drive past his house once. Said she just wanted to see where he lived. I thought it was a little strange, but Alicia had such a soft heart. She always wanted to see the good in people." Frank's expression grew serious. "Did the police know about this when they investigated her disappearance?" "Yes," I told. Them," Amy confirmed. "They interviewed everyone in our class, including Jason. But by that time, Alicia had already started dating Brandon Knox. He was their main suspect initially." Frank nodded slowly. "I remember Brandon. He used to come over to the house to pick her up. We were suspicious of him too, but he had a solid alibi for the time she disappeared." "Do you know what happened to Brandon?" he asked. "Last I heard, he left town not long after Alicia vanished," Amy replied. "The pressure and suspicion were just too much for him, I think." Frank's thoughts were spinning. "And Jason, do you remember anything else about their relationship?" "Not much," Amy admitted. "Alicia didn't talk about him much, other than those few curious questions." Frank looked back at the photo of Jason in the torn magazine page. Then why would Alicia have used his page as a bookmark? And the fact that she was close to him, even briefly, without Elaine or me knowing. That feels important. He mentioned that thought to Amy, who gave a small laugh. "Oh, that page? It was from Alicia's favorite magazine. I hated Jason so much, and Alicia knew it. She tore out the page with his face on it and just folded it up." She said there was nothing better to do with it than use it as a bookmark. Frank considered that for a moment, then nodded. Do you know where Jason is now? Amy reached for her phone and scrolled through a few messages. Actually, our high school alumni group just had a reunion last weekend at Jason's house. I didn't go, but they shared his address in the group chat. She held out the message for Frank to see. Would you mind sending me that address? Frank asked, pulling out his own phone. They exchanged phone numbers, and Amy forwarded him the address. Do you think Jason might be involved somehow? She asked, her voice hesitant. I don't know, Frank replied honestly, but I think the police should be aware of his connection to Alicia, even if it was brief. The fact that Elaine and I never knew about it, it makes me wonder. When Alicia started dating Brandon, everything was open, nothing was hidden. Frank rose to his feet, thanking Amy sincerely for her time and the information. As he moved toward the door, Amy gently touched his arm. Please tell Elaine I said hello, she said softly. And thank you for letting me keep the book. It means more to me than you could possibly know. Frank gave her a reassuring nod, the yearbook now tucked under his arm, and stepped out into the brightening afternoon. His mind was heavy with fresh questions about his daughter's life and her disappearance. Back in his car, Frank sat silently for a moment, the yearbook resting on the passenger seat beside him. His thoughts were racing, circling around the new information Amy had shared. Learning that Alicia had spent time with Jason Murray, even if only briefly, was unsettling. Not necessarily because of who Jason was, but because neither Frank nor Elaine had ever known. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Detective Ron Keller, the officer who had been assigned to Alicia's case all those years ago. Frank knew Keller had retired, but he still lived in town. The phone rang and then went to voicemail. It wasn't surprising for a quiet Sunday afternoon. Frank stared down at his phone, then shifted his gaze to the address Amy had sent. He knew he should head back home to Elaine. He had promised her they would finally put this chapter of their lives behind them today. But something about what Amy had said, especially the story behind that torn-out magazine page used as a bookmark, kept tugging at him. Alicia's questions about Jason, her curiosity about where he lived, and the way she'd wondered if someone like him could truly change, it all kept echoing in Frank's mind. Just a quick drive-by, he murmured to himself, starting the engine, just to see where it is. 20 minutes later, Frank found himself driving through one of Mornington's more upscale neighborhoods. The wide, tranquil streets were lined with large houses, each boasting manicured lawns and pristine facades, a sharp contrast to the modest home where he and Elaine had raised Alicia. Eventually, he located Jason's address, a sprawling two-story house complete with a circular driveway and professionally maintained landscaping. The property was noticeably grander than the neighboring homes, a clear sign of Jason's success since high school. Frank parked his car across the street, making sure to stay at a distance while he observed the house. The front gate stood open. As he watched, a man exited the front door, walking alongside a young woman. Even from afar, Frank could recognize the older version of the boy from the yearbook, Jason Murray, now in his early 40s, still striking and carrying himself with the poise of someone who had grown comfortable with success. Jason walked the woman to her car, kissed her on the cheek and waved as she drove away. But as he turned to return inside, his gaze swept across the street and landed directly on Frank's vehicle. That's when Frank realized too late that his windows weren't tinted. He was clearly visible. Jason's demeanor shifted immediately. His posture straightened, becoming guarded and alert. Seeing no point in pretending otherwise, Frank shut off the car engine, stepped out, and walked toward the open gate. "Good afternoon," he called out, doing his best to sound casual. "Jason Murray, right?" Jason didn't reciprocate the friendly tone. "Who are you and why are you watching my house?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp and suspicious. Are you paparazzi, a reporter? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude, Frank responded, stopping a few feet short of the gate to maintain a respectful distance. My name is Frank Sanders. I'm Alicia Sanders' father. She was in your graduating class. She disappeared 22 years ago. Jason's expression changed in an instant. His eyes narrowed. What do you want? Frank was taken aback by how cold and defensive Jason's response was. I heard there was a class reunion here last weekend, Frank said, keeping his voice calm. I'm just trying to gather any information I can about my daughter. I was told you might have been close to her, at least for a time. Jason cut him off sharply. Who told you that? Amy? Frank nodded slightly. Yes, Jason's voice grew sharper. She didn't even come to the reunion. I'm not trying to cause any trouble, Frank said gently. I'm just looking for some answers. It's been 22 years and we still don't know what really happened to Alicia. Jason's response was immediate and defensive. Why are you asking me? I was never Alicia's boyfriend. I barely knew her, and I certainly was never interested in her that way. I already told the police that back then, and I don't appreciate being questioned about it again. Frank was taken aback by the intensity in Jason's tone. I never said you were her boyfriend, he replied. I just heard you two were close at one point. If we ever talked at school, Jason said, brushing it off, it was probably because I needed to borrow some money or get help with homework. That's all. And I always returned what I borrowed. There was never any issue between us. I told the police everything back then. Despite the dismissive nature of Jason's words, Frank couldn't help but notice how tense the man had become. Jason was now shifting from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the street nervously, as though checking to see if anyone was watching the exchange. I don't get why you're suddenly showing up at my house asking these questions, Jason continued. I have a reputation to protect. I don't want some reporter or anyone from the public seeing us out here talking and starting rumors.